Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Adam Lazarus, the author of The Wingmen, the unlikely, unusual, and unbreakable friendship between John Glenn and Ted Williams. He's written 5 books now and has written for USA Today and ESPN, the magazine. Thank you so much for being here, Adam.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. When you look at the backs of baseball cards, which is one of my favorite hobbies, or in today's day and age, baseballreference.com, sometimes you see 3 years of inactivity right when someone should have been in their prime years. For Ted Williams, it says, did not play military service in 1943, 1944, and 1945, when he would have been 24, 25, and 26 years old. He was serving in World War II. What I never noticed about the back of his baseball card is that in the years 1952 and 1953, he played a combined 43 games, the years he was called up to active duty to serve in the Korean War. Those were the years that he met aviator John Glenn. So before we get to their friendship, Adam, what was it like for a ball player to say, I'll see you at the ballpark in a few years, I'm headed off to war?
Well, it was very unexpected for Ted Williams to be recalled to active service. A few other ball players were. It was a strange time in the Korean War period because a lot of soldiers had gone to fight, Marines, Navy, Army, Air Force. But after a certain period, they determined that soldiers and sailors and pilots wouldn't have to stay in an undetermined amount of time, and they needed to bring in reinforcements. And there were a lot of what were called, at least for the Marine Corps, what were called volunteer reservists who were could be called back at any point. A lot of them didn't expect to be called back. Ted Williams was one of those people. He did not expect to be called back, even though he retained his Marine Corps status. Yeah, it was a big shock. If you can imagine something like that happen today, it would never happen. It was a big deal when Pat Tillman got called. When Pat Tillman chose to go back into service right after September 11th, but Ted Williams wasn't exactly eager to jump back into the service. He was recalled, and he pursued legal avenues to get out of it, and he had hoped that he would be declared ineligible because of an injury he'd suffered on the baseball field a couple years earlier. But the Marine Corps wanted him. A lot of people thought they wanted him to drum up good publicity, to show people that, this is an important war. We've reactivated Ted Williams. The true story that I uncovered is that it was sort of by accident they recalled him. One of the people in charge of reviewing candidate files for people to be reactivated to service.
Before we get to that though, because I have some questions about it, and it's an awesome story. Explain just where we're at. I know you're not necessarily a political historian, but what do we need to know? What are the basics about how America became involved in what Harry Truman didn't want to even call a war, in quotes, to how we became involved in Korea? What was the commitment that the U.S. had made to the peninsula?
Well, we had agreed to participate in this police action, as it was called, but it was more of a United Nations action. The United Nations had just begun a few years earlier. I think we committed to stopping communism. That was the big concern. And we were doing, this is the beginning of the communist scare of the early 1950s. And we committed troops, and we committed a lot of troops. Over 740,000 troops were activated or served in some capacity during the Korean War. And it was on the heels of World War II, where a lot of people had been called into service. And there were all these people who were still eligible to be brought back to service and to serve in military capacity. And I think we were, off the heels of the victory in World War II, we were grabbing that status as the world power. And I think we decided to, go crush communism on behalf of capitalism.
Just about any year you ask this question for when it comes to Ted Williams' baseball career, the answer is going to be he was going pretty well as a baseball player. But where was he at in his baseball career as 1952 came around?
Well, he had already he won his best season. Everybody knows in 1941 he hit 406. His last man to hit 400. The next year he won the Triple Crown. And then he, as you mentioned earlier, missed 3 seasons to the war. But when he came back from the war, in his first year back, he won the MVP. And then in 1949, he won. He had really his best year. The Red Sox should have won the pennant. I think he had career highs in home runs and RBIs. He really should have won the Triple Crown. He missed the batting title by literal percentage points, less than a single point. 1950, he suffered an elbow injury that a lot of people thought really damaged his career, and he broke his elbow. He had to have surgery, but he came back and became his regular, usual self. So 50, 51, 52, going into the 52 season, he was, especially since Joe DiMaggio had retired the previous year, you'd have to consider him the best hitter in baseball.
I loved one of the sentences you just said in there, which is that the Red Sox should have won the pennant that year. How many times has that been uttered, right, throughout baseball? For those young fans, they can't imagine a time when it had been 8 decades since they had any success. All right. I had no idea, as you said, I had no idea that Ted Williams was called up to service accidentally, and as you put it, I think on the back of the book, inexplicably. Who doesn't realize that they're drafting Ted Williams when they look at that name on the card there, Theodore Williams? Explain that story, Fred. Unbelievable.
So this story I had never seen in other biographies. I came across it in a newspaper article from the early 1970s. And then I tracked down the son of the person who tells this story, and he had recorded it. And he recorded his father's military career before he died. His father has died many years ago, but he tells this story that he was one of the people in charge of reviewing these volunteer reserve candidates' files and seeing who was eligible to come back and who had passed all their health exams and who had good training and who knew how to fly planes and had combat experience, or at least significant flying experience. And this file came across his desk, Williams Theodore S. And Williams is a common name.
Williams Theodore S. That's it, right?
It is. It's an interesting story, and as you see in the book, the person who did this was actually John Glenn's college football teammate.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah.
It's a story that I'd never seen recorded, and I was very eager to uncover it. But yeah, I don't know. The only thing that I've looked at this, I've thought about this many times. There wasn't ESPN, there wasn't television, or at least regular 24-hour day television. He probably hadn't seen Ted Williams' face, so he didn't recognize him from, I'm sure he had a headshot attached to his file. And even in the scoreboard, in the box scores in the newspaper, probably just said Williams. So if he wasn't an avid baseball fan, he probably would have missed. Maybe he missed that. It may have been late at night. He probably had gone through hundreds of files. But yeah, it's a funny story.
He even got a call that was like, "Do you know who you just called up?" And he was like, "Yeah, I'm going back to bed, buddy. I don't care who I just called to serve. He's qualified." You say that he was as skilled in the cockpit as he was on the field. How did that happen? How does someone who's a prolific baseball player become a great pilot? And what was his first tour of duty like in World War II?
Well, in World War II, he earned his wings. He actually had a lot of trouble with his early entry into the military. He had protested being chosen for the military because he had to be a caretaker and supporter for his mother. But eventually he found his way into the Navy and trained, and he just had these skills. Everybody talks about his eyesight. I think he's himself, when he was alive, said that it was sort of blown out of proportion. That people said he had 25 vision. He said that was overblown. But he had tremendous eyesight, and he had tremendous hand-eye coordination, which makes you a great ball player. And at the time, especially in these propeller planes in the early years during World War II, before the jets, it took that hand-eye coordination to be a great pilot. And he he just had great skills. In World War II, he never was deployed abroad, but he was so gifted as a pilot that they made him an instructor. And he was an instructor at Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida, which is one of the most important training facilities for the Navy during World War II. He played a lot of baseball too. There's a whole book about that, his time playing baseball during World War II. But I think, he was just extremely gifted. And again, I think it was his hand-eye coordination that gave him an advantage. Now, I will say, and this may lead to something you want to ask about later, but World War II, as I said, was these propeller planes, which were not nearly as advanced as the jets that they flew in the Korean War and that we still fly today. He wasn't as good as a jet pilot. He had a lot of training to make up for. He had some inexperience that John Glenn pointed out later on. It was a huge transfer going from the Corsair, which was the plane he mostly flew during World War II, to the jet. So he was a little bit behind the eight ball when he came into the Korean War.
All right, because I'm obsessed with baseball, I've asked a lot about Ted Williams here. Who was John Glenn before he was an astronaut, before he was even old enough to drive? How did he become fascinated by flying?
I think part of it was that he tells the story that when he was 5 years old, his dad took him up to the mid 1920s, where planes were, a total novelty. Even before Charles Lindbergh made his famous flight across the Atlantic in 1927. I think it was, they didn't have video games. They didn't have TV. They didn't have all these things. He saw an airplane. His dad took him up in an airplane one day and he was hooked, and he liked to build model airplanes and fly model airplanes. And I think from the day he was old enough to really understand what it was, he wanted to be a pilot. Even before World War II started, he tried to get a civilian's pilot license, which he did. And then once World War II started, and everybody was joining up, his first order of business was to go and get himself a military aviation spot.
Smart.
And I was just going to say that, he advanced very quickly. He was a great pilot. He was extremely gifted. He had, we talk about Ted Williams and what it takes to be a great athlete and a great baseball player, or today, great football player, whatever, the drive and the ambition to want to be the best. And that John Glenn certainly had that in terms of being a pilot and his advancement in the military. He wanted to be the best possible pilot in the world. And to do that, he had to advance within the Navy and then the Marine Corps, and fly the more challenging planes and take the more challenging assignments. In fact, he was a hero during World War II. 57 very deadly, dangerous missions that he flew over in the Pacific. And then he became a career Marine, spent his life as a Marine. And when the Korean War rolled around, I never saw a great explanation as to why, but he wasn't sent to combat. I think they were sort of grooming him for bigger things. They probably thought he would be a general one day, or some higher up ranking officer, and they didn't want to send him to the Korean War. And he begged them to send him to the Korean War. He wrote letters to superior officers, send me to the Korean War. And his explanation was, I've been training in the Marines for 10 years now. What have I been training for if I'm not going to be used in this war that's costing American lives? So that's who John Glenn was. He was ambitious, hardworking, dedicated, but also he knew his duty. That was the most important thing to him.
What similarities and differences are there in their childhoods that you could identify that foreshadowed them becoming friends?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
That's an interesting question, because they couldn't have lived two different. I mean, from the time they were born to the time both of them died, they really couldn't have lived very.
Yeah, you compare them at the end. I was like, oh boy, John Glenn was like a nice guy.
I think Ted Williams grew up in a broken home. He never really saw his father very infrequently. He had a brother, but his mother was worked for the Salvation Army, and she was rarely home. I guess we would call him a latchkey kid today. He didn't have a support system growing up. He was lucky that he found baseball, or who knows how his life would have turned out. John Glenn grew up in a loving home with religious parents who cared about him, and spent the rest of their life. He, cared for when they were older. He cared for them. I think the one thing that did connect them was this sense of duty, serving their country, patriotism, because you have a lot of things you could say about Ted Williams and his service in the Marine Corps. He knew he had a duty to perform, and when he was there, he did it. That was obviously John Glenn's entire life in the Marine Corps, but they both were, I guess I wouldn't say obsessive compulsive, but they were obsessive in nature about whatever it was that they were interested in. Was 100%. It was 100% all the time. Ted Williams was baseball and fishing. John Glenn, it was being a pilot. Later, it was being a senator. They just were as dedicated and committed to whatever they were doing as possible. And I think that was one of the things that sort of brought them together.
So Ted Williams gets inexplicably and accidentally drafted, called up to service because he's qualified and someone checks his name off on a box. How did John Glenn decide on having Ted Williams as his wingman? And I guess what is a wingman in a technical sense? Not the bar thing I'm talking about. Yeah.
A squadron of pilots flying in combat missions. They're sort of paired together in two groups. There's two groups, make the two pilots together as a section, and then there's a division, and then you build up a squadron from there. So it's groups of two. And there's a leader and a wingman. The leader, the wingman follows the leader. It's just the way that, excuse me. It's the way they stay in formation and stay in, everybody knows their assignment. And during the Korean War, for the Marines, the leader was always a career Marine, someone who had spent their entire career, years of full-time Marine Corps service. And at the time, his wingman was always someone who was a reservist or a recall reservist, just like Ted Williams was, someone who didn't have nearly as much experience flying these planes and flying combat missions. And so they paired the leader with the wingman. So that way the inexperienced guy was with the experienced guy. And John Glenn was actually the operations officer for this squadron. And one of his jobs was assigning this wingman to this leader and this wingman to this leader. And that was just one of his tasks. And after a while, it became clear no one wanted to fly with John Glenn because he was aggressive and took chances in the air and was always going around taking third and fourth runs at the same target, which was very dangerous. And the job of the wingman is to follow him. And these wingmen, who were reservists, either very young or just inexperienced pilots, didn't like to follow John Glenn into these trenches and into these bunkers and caves and things where they were being shot at constantly for a third and fourth time. Their job was to drop their bombs and sort of get out of there. That wasn't what John Glenn liked to do. John Glenn was, as he said, he was very intent on war making, was the way he put it, because he had missed the first 2 years of the war and he had begged his superior officers to go into service. So he was going to get everything he could out of every mission he was on. And between the wingmen, the reserve recallists who didn't want to fly with John Glenn, and the fact that Ted Williams seemed to like flying with John Glenn, and whenever he got the chance, Glenn paired Williams with him, and they had missions together. They didn't fly dozens and dozens of missions together. They flew only a handful together, but several of them were very memorable, as anybody who picks up the book will read.
Yeah, well, we'll get into those real quick. I love to do a little bit of an aside, though, during our conversations here on this show and just probe the author a little bit on what exactly drew them to this book and what their sources were and things like that. So the first thing I notice is that your books have an interesting flow. I see lots of football. I see some tennis, and I am going to ask you about that giant Super Bowl a little bit later in the show. But what led you to Ted Williams and John Glenn from your other topics? Steve Young, the Giants, and Bill's Super Bowl, and what brought you to this particular topic? How did you discover it, and what made you say a book needed to be done?
Well, I was just on the internet one day and I saw a photo. It was Veterans Day, and one of the baseball Twitter accounts that posts, put photos of Lou Gehrig and Willie Mays and Sandy Koufax. Someone posted in honor of Veterans Day this photo of Ted Williams and John Glenn, which is actually in the book. It's a photo in the insert, and it said something like John Glenn and Ted Williams were paired together at the same Marine base during the Korean War in 1953. And, I was an avid baseball history fan growing up. I spent, every year my family visited Cooperstown. I knew all the facts, all the numbers of Ted Williams, of 406 and 521 home runs and the MVPs, and, have a picture of me as a kid near the statue at the Hall of Fame. And conversely, I'm from Ohio, and the first real election I ever remember is John Glenn running for re-election in the Senate in 1992. It was, I remember we had a school project. I was in sixth grade, and it was our job to read all about and write reports about all the candidates from Ohio. So I knew a little bit about John Glenn, and my dad was also my dad grew up during the space age, so he was a big John Glenn fan. We watched The Right Stuff several times, and so I knew who John Glenn was. And this intersection just floored me. I had no idea of this. So, and I must have Googled it, or I typed John Glenn and Ted Williams, and there was a little bit written about it that they served together during the Korean War. And I was kind of just interested. What an odd pairing. And I think I found a couple of articles that, particularly after Ted Williams died, that had mentioned this, but then talked more at length about their friendship through the years. And it was just an amazing, strange pairing of two, as I've said earlier, and it says throughout the book, just two completely different individuals who had this weird friendship that for two giants, two American icons and not many people know about it. I didn't know about it.
I didn't know. Yeah.
I tell about it. I think when I was trying to get the book sold in my proposal, I said it was just sort of an offhand thing that I made an analogy for people that because the years matched up and the ages matched up. I said something like it would be if like Shaq and Ted Cruz somehow served in the Operation Desert Storm together for 6 months and nobody knew it because, that would be amazing. And that's kind of what it was. I mean, Shaq was the biggest athlete one of the biggest athletes of his generation. Ted Williams was. Ted Cruz, big senator, and completely polar opposite kind of people, polar opposite kind of lives. So that once I saw that, I just read more about it and thought that the story spanned all these years, that it would make a great book.
What were your sources for this book? I love the fact that you say FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Law. I don't get a lot of that from the authors who I interview here. So explain your sources for this book. How did you piece this all together? Well, start with that, but go ahead. Start with that. I have a follow-up question, but go ahead.
Well, many, many different types. I always, all the books you mentioned earlier, I always believe in newspaper archives being like the foundation of these kinds of stories, mainly because those things are set in stone. They're timeless. Whatever they said in 1952 doesn't have the benefit of hindsight. And you could interview someone in 2023 about something that happened in 1960, and I think the 1960 interview is better than the 2023 interview. It's just the way it is. So that's the foundation of the work I did. But I drew in a lot of sources. The Freedom of Information Act and NARA stuff that I got, those were mainly from Marine Corps military files of both Ted Williams and John Glenn, and actually some other of the people mentioned in the book. And the richest thing was I did get dozens and dozens of pages of Ted Williams' naval medical history files, which were really interesting. There's a lot of medical information in the book about Ted Williams' career and how it sort of ended his military career. So those are some of the things when you see the FOIA requests and things. It was mostly from things like that. But I think the two best sources I got for this were there are still 3 pilots who flew with John Glenn and Ted Williams that are still alive, who I was able to interview. They're all in their late 90s, and they all had great stories, very, very eager to talk about it. So I was very fortunate to talk to them. And I was very fortunate to find a lot of the children of the pilots who flew with Ted Williams and John Glenn. I did interview Ted Williams' daughter, who's still alive, and I did interview both John Glenn's children who are still alive. So those were good sources for me. And obviously they had firsthand knowledge of a lot of these things. But some of the other children of these pilots, their they kept letters and records that their fathers from the Korean War had sent home to their mothers and their children. And a lot of them had really great detail. One of them in particular had all these letters about, I saw Ted Williams in the mess hall today. He did this. Ted Williams crashed his plane today, which is something that happens in the book. So those were really neat firsthand accounts that haven't really been explored before.
Can you compare, and this is the follow-up question, can you compare and contrast what it's like to research a public figure like John Glenn, someone who served the public, whose career was made in the Senate, working for NASA, in the military, with someone like Ted Williams, who was, of course, a public figure, but there's not necessarily an archive built for a former baseball player unless the people who guard his legacy are willing to give those papers up. So what was it like to sort of wrestle with those two worlds?
Well, for Ted Williams, he did not get along with the media very much. But fortunately, he did. He would open his mouth when he felt like it, and he would talk off the cuff and give good sound bites to reporters. So he did say, there is a lot about his career on and off the field that is public record if you do the work and you read through the books and the magazine pieces. He talked a lot, especially after his career ended. He wrote an autobiography. There's been several biographies written about him. But he talked a lot about his career here and there. So it wasn't hard for me to find things, all the things he said about his military service. He wrote his autobiography, talked about his military service, and then he contributed to another book that was about Marine Corps history in the first person. So a lot of open detail there about his service. And he I think he wrestled with his role as a public figure throughout his entire life. And fortunately for this book, in the later years, I think he came to grips with it and was willing to talk more openly about everything: his personal life, his baseball career, his military service. And like you said, John Glenn, because he was in the public eye for decades, even well out, Ted Williams retired from baseball at age 42, and presumably he was out of the spotlight after that, while John Glenn's life really began at age 42 when he went to space and became a U.S. senator and eventually a presidential candidate. So again, people were always interviewing him. People were never shy about reaching out. That's one of the fortunate things you mentioned about writing about a public figure. There's very few opportunities where a public figure can't go on the record.
Why did you think the book opens with a really sobering kind of passage, which is about some of the words that you had to use in this book that, you make plain are simply offensive today, but were in common use back when the crux of this story takes place. And you essentially apologize to readers for having to put those words in, but you argue it was important to put them in. Why did you think it was important to keep the original language and the original text to the different quotations that are in the book to preserve it for the modern reader?
I thought it did show authenticity of a sort of a mentality of that era. We live in a much more hypersensitive era of things we say and the language we use, and we're more politically correct, or however you want to put it. And I'm not taking sides one way or the other on that. But I did think it was important to show the type of language that was used. And as I said in the book, I think that it was pointed, the way those words were used as a way probably to dehumanize the enemy and put them at a distance and not consider them on the same level, human beings as we are, the communists, or whatever words they were using to refer to the enemies used during World War II and the Korean War. I think it shows just authenticity of that era.
We have done a number of history of baseball episodes on this show, including the 69 Mets. We've done an episode on Jackie Robinson. We did a book called The Summer of Beer and Whiskey by my friend Ed Acorn, who is one of the modern record holders for appearances on this show, I believe with 3, and I'm sure he's angling for a 4th. And we'll be happy to have him. What is it about baseball and history that just go together?
I think I'm a product of the Ken Burns baseball series from many years ago. I see the parallel running. That's the I'm not a documentary expert, but it's the greatest documentary I've ever seen. It does such a great job of bringing the history of baseball along with the history of America. And some of the people interviewed in that talk about their perspective on how baseball fits into American culture. I think one of the best takeaways from that is I think it's Gerald Early says something like 1,000 years from now, the only thing America will be remembered for is the Constitution, jazz music, and baseball.
Yeah, I love that quote. Yeah,
I
don't know if it's true, but it sounds great. Right?
Yeah, well, I don't think. Yeah, I think we won't be around to find out. But I do think there are just these parallels between American history. You mentioned Jackie Robinson. It's probably not a coincidence that baseball was integrated right after World War II. And the '60s and the tumultuous times in the country and the tumultuous times in baseball, Americans moving, to the West Coast and baseball moving to the West Coast. I think that's one of the things is as America has grown, baseball grew. And I think that's one of the things that binds the two together. And, I have my problems with modern Major League Baseball.
Oh, gosh, do I.
So
many.
Modern Major League Baseball has made misstep after misstep, I think, in the last 30 years. I actually am more drawn to watching the NFL on TV, but I do still think that baseball is the greatest game ever designed. And I think there's something to it. It just appeals to Americans in some capacity. I don't know. I'm not philosophical enough. I'm not Bob Costas or one of those people who could break it down that well, but I just think there's something that appeals to Americans about baseball, which is why it really hasn't caught on in many other places.
You know what? One of my favorite sayings that I came up with myself, which is that baseball is in every movie. And I test that as I'm watching movies. And I didn't think never mind a game, you might see a baseball somewhere in the background or someone's watching a game and they turn to go to look at one of the main characters or something like that. And I was at Barbie this weekend and I was wondering, is baseball going to be in Barbie? And sure enough, there was a Barbie doll dressed up as a baseball player. And I went, bing, there it is. All right, back to our plot. What was, and I don't know how much you want to give away of the book, but what was their service like together? Describe a couple of their missions that they went on without giving away too much. Just give readers a sense of the adventures that John Glenn and Ted Williams would go on that would form the basis of their friendship over the next 50 years or so.
I think the one that stands out most, and a lot of people who did know the Ted Williams, John Glenn angle, and this is something John Glenn wrote about in his autobiography. Essentially, Ted Williams screwed up and fired a bunch of rockets at an area that he wasn't supposed to. That was according to John Glenn's map, was Allied held territory, which would have resulted in a friendly fire catastrophe. And John Glenn went berserk, and they went back to base, and he was chewing them out. And it turns out that the map had changed, and he didn't actually kill a bunch of American soldiers. But this is their first mission together, and it was just the two of them. A lot of these missions could be as many, at least even within their squadron, could be 20 or 25 pilots. Now, larger missions, with other squadrons in the Air Force, could be hundreds of planes. But they were on this very small mission, just the two of them. And it nearly resulted in John Glenn being court-martialed. He would have been responsible for it because he was the leader of the mission. And Ted Williams bombing American troops. And so that was their first mission together. I think that sort of baptism by fire was a good start for their relationship, their friendship, and it's detailed in the book. And then a couple of the other missions, Ted Williams' plane got hit. I'll leave the details out for the readers, but John Glenn guided him back to base. And so I think they had these moments. You talk about the band of brothers and all those things, friendships forged in war. Again, they didn't fly 100, 200 missions together. They only flew, as far as I can tell, 8 or 9 missions, full pre-briefed missions together. They may have flown some more that weren't recorded in the records. But for 2 of those missions to result in something like that, I think bonded them in a way that is something to speak of. And even John Glenn said years later, even if they hadn't been these harrowing near catastrophe missions, John Glenn said something like, when you fly across the border into war, there's a bond. Like, it doesn't matter if your plane's shot down, if you're captured, if you're just going into battle together. It was going into battle together, and it wasn't a big troop of 400 or 600 men. It was sometimes 2 or 4 or 8 pilots, and I think there was something forged during those times together.
How did their friendship change and evolve after the war? They get back to America, and what does each do, and why do they stay in touch?
Well, it's very interesting. This is one of the reasons why, in the early times, I struggled with whether or not this could be a full book, because when they got back to war, from the war, they both returned to their lives. Ted Williams went back to playing baseball, and John Glenn went back to the Marines, and eventually the Navy test pilot work that got him the attention of NASA, and then for years he was trying to become a senator and became a senator, while Ted Williams becomes a major league manager, and they led very disparate, separate lives. And they stayed in touch. They traded, we would say they traded emails, whatever. They traded, Christmas cards, and they probably talked on the phone once in a while, but they didn't spend a lot of time together. And it isn't until they're sort of, as it became, when they were old men, they sort of reconnected. And there's these parts in the book where I think their friendship really reconvened. And I think a lot of it had to do with, they survived the war, and in ways, I think when they were getting into their 70s and early 80s, they sort of survived life. And I think there was a bond in that way that, there weren't a lot of their guys from their generation left in their late 70s and early 80s. And I think that was part of it. There's a lot of ups and downs in there that if you pick up the book, you'll read that when John Glenn ran for president, they sort of seeked out Ted Williams' endorsement, and he didn't give it to him. And that was
they were different parties, by the way,
yes,
right?
That's a big part of the book.
Ted Williams was a Republican, John Glenn a Democrat.
It's something I sort of explore in the book, and when I talk about their many differences is personal and social and moral, but conservative Republican, liberal Democrat, and that's sort of an underlying theme of the book as well. So there's these ups and downs, but I like the way they sort of become, these old men together sitting at a table in Florida in a retirement community, looking at old photos and planes from their time in the service. And I don't know, sometimes we have friends that you don't see for many years, but you reconnect, or even if you don't reconnect, just once in a while you get in touch. I have a friend who, I don't talk to a lot. I see very rarely, but if he calls me or if I call him, we talk for like an hour and a half, and we might as well be back in our dorm room together. And I kind of got the sense that was what it was with Ted Williams and John Glenn. They didn't spend weekends barbecuing together in the backyard with their kids running around and going on cruises together, family vacations. But they were, when they got back together, it was reliving those old days in Korea.
How did John Glenn go from storied fighter pilot to a career as an astronaut, and then, my goodness, one of the most important astronauts, and then becoming a powerful U.S. senator with presidential aspirations? I'm just curious if you were able to figure out what makes someone so good at everything. Pilot is way different than politician, way different than being an astronaut. How did he do it? What made him so good at everything?
Well, the early NASA astronauts, the Mercury 7, were all pilots, all military pilots, with most of them, I think, had significant combat experience. And they wanted these, battle-hardened, fearless, brave men to be the first people to sit on top of a rocket and go up into space, which is what it was. They were sitting on a massive rocket in a little capsule, and they just got shot up into space. So they needed men who were fearless and certainly willing to risk their life for their country, which all these military aviators were. So that's how sort of NASA came on. He became on the NASA radar. It was his ambition and his drive. And I think he was very conscious of his clean-cut Marine, picture,
Ethos.
Poster boy kind of, and that obviously appealed to the people making the decisions. So he was, an obvious choice for the NASA program, and then eventually for the first of the more important Mercury missions, the first orbital mission.
And he wasn't just a screwball senator. I mean, he became a chair of an
Well,
important
I
committee.
think
I mean, he wasn't just a
no.
placeholder for,
I think it was to his detriment sometimes. Some of the people who worked with him, he wasn't a politician. He may have been in politics. He was not a politician. I think of all the especially today, it's got to be hard for people to point to anyone in either party and say, that man that is pure integrity, that there is no falsehoods about the way he acts, everything he says he believes. That was John Glenn. He did not speak politics. He did not play the games. He cared about getting funding for the NASA program, or funding for military veterans, or Department of Defense, get the Department of Defense what it needed. And I think that was one of the reasons why he was a respected senator, was because he put country ahead of party every time. And that was, I think, how he succeeded so well in the Senate.
You tell this kind of final poignant scene where Ted Williams watches Glenn ride up into the air once again on Space Shuttle Discovery. Just describe that scene for us and what it meant to both men.
Well, Ted Williams was really failing in health at that point, and it was a very hard trip for him to make. It was, even though the launch took place in Florida, and this is 1998. This is October 1998. He was in a wheelchair. He had 3 strokes. He could barely stand up.
He only had 4 years to live at that point.
Yes, he died. Yeah. He died less than 4 years later, and it was very difficult for him to travel. But John Glenn personally came to his house and personally invited him. He said, "I'm going back up to space. I want you to be there." And Ted Williams said, "I will be there." And they had to, his kids had to get him in his wheelchair and parade him around. And the launch was very early in the morning, and they had to be there very early. But he was there, and as he said, when the rocket went up, he rose up out of his chair and said, "That's my friend." And when John Glenn obviously wasn't there to see it, but he heard about that later, and it was one of the things that he said at the end was, it was very touching for him, for his friend to come. I think, we all feel duty and responsibility and loyalty to people, and I think Ted Williams felt loyalty and responsibility to John Glenn to be there for his friend.
What did John Glenn say about Ted Williams after Williams died? Williams died in 2002 and John Glenn in 2016. So Glenn had a number of years left to live. How did Glenn reflect on his friend's life?
I think the best, this is something he said several times, but he said it when he died. Everybody remembers that Ted Williams hit 406 I'm paraphrasing, that he hit 406 in 1941 for the Red Sox. But he knew him as someone who batted 1,000 for the Marine Corps in the United States of America. So that sort of sums it up. Again, I think John Glenn knew many, many famous people. He sat with presidents. He was very good friends with the Kennedys. He was a CEO. He was one of the original astronauts. He was very good friends with Neil Armstrong. I think he wasn't about celebrity. He didn't care that Ted Williams was one of the greatest baseball players of all time. What earned his respect was the service he gave to the country in 2 wars, and particularly during the Korean War when he fought side by side by him.
All right. Tampa Bay where I live, hosted Super Bowl 25. And I have to ask you about how this became a book, because until I looked at your website, I never would have thought there was a book about this one game. You're talking to an old New York City Giants fan here. So what made you say that wide right kick was the culmination of a story that had to be a book?
Well, I mean, you just touched on it, wide right. I'd have to think about it, but I still don't think there's a Super Bowl where a win or a loss hung on the last play. Even the field goals.
What about what about the interception that the Pats?
Yeah, but there was still 14
okay, I don't remember
left.
That. Okay.
It was the absolute last play of the game. And the field goals at the end of games, Vinatieri kicking field goals, those were tie games. Oh. So if they missed it, would have gone to overtime.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So that's the way I look at it.
Yeah. Win or
Even
lose.
Montana's touchdown pass to John Taylor, there was still 30 seconds left, I think. So the Bills could have won the game.
Final decisive play. Yeah.
And when I was growing up, that was the sort of the quintessential David and Goliath. Even though the Giants were nothing compared to, sure, they'd won a Super Bowl, but that Bills offense was unstoppable. And the Giants had a backup quarterback, and they were all aging. Lawrence Taylor was aging, Carl Banks was aging. That was an older team. Otis Anderson was the oldest running back in the league. The Bills were this young, up and coming, flashy offense that scored 51 points in the conference championship. The Giants barely survived on 5 field goals. They didn't even score a touchdown in the NFC Championship game. But they were also just two completely different teams. Once I'm not a military historian or an expert on the military, but when the Desert Storm Persian Gulf War was like 9 days old during that. And I remember
the yellow ribbons being around.
And I remember Whitney Houston's national anthem was a very patriotic moment. There was some concern about whether the game would either be played. I remember I was only 9 years old when that happened, but that sort of stuck with me.
Yeah, so I was 7.
It was sort of a culmination of a lot of different unique things. The football element I thought was just tremendous because I loved that K-gun offense with Thurman Thomas and Jim Kelly and points, and the Giants just dragging out games and taking the air out of the football is what Parcells would say. I also was fascinated by Parcells' coaching staff, and I thought right there, that was around the time David.
That's a story right there, yeah.
Belichick. I was fortunate to interview Belichick for the book, but Tom Coughlin was on that staff, Charlie Weiss was on that staff, Romeo Crennel was on that staff. It was just a lot of personalities, a lot of stalwarts of the era of the NFL. And then again, ending with that moment, and poor Scott Norwood. I don't know if they've forgiven him in Buffalo or not.
I know.
But that was, the ending of all endings for a Super Bowl. And to me, it's sort of, the Bills are the strangest dynasty, I think, in sports history. To go to 4 straight Super Bowls and lose them all, and lose 3 of them one of them in heartbreaking fashion, and 3 of them they were essentially blown out.
Right.
That was the start of it. So I just thought there were all these facets to it that I thought were interesting. And it was also the 25th anniversary of the Super Bowl. It was the silver anniversary. So it was also it was an opportunity for me to sort of recap some Super Bowl history. And if you read that book, there are these flashback moments where I highlight a famous moment in Super Bowl history and sort of parallel it with a moment in that game in Super Bowl 25. So it was a fun opportunity. It was my first NFL book. It was an opportunity to do a lot of football history in one book.
The documentary, The Four Falls of Buffalo on ESPN is really good, by the way. But maybe it's not quite my first football memory, but one of my first football memories. I was a baseball fan really growing up. But my first major football memory is being crouched on the floor of my living room with my parents praying that the guy would miss the field goal. And sure enough, he did. All right. Some rapid fire here. Fenway or Wrigley?
I'm going to Wrigley for the first time ever next week, so I'd have to take a rain check on it. I've been to Fenway. I've been to Fenway. Love Fenway. I actually went the year Ted Williams died, so there was a lot of Ted Williams celebration going on. But yeah, I would guess it's going to be Fenway, but I'll to be determined.
I kind of think Wrigley, but I don't want to say for sure. But I've been to both. I've been to Wrigley once, Fenway 4 or 5 times, so I love them both. Incredible places. They stand totally apart from the rest of Major League Baseball. The stadiums in Major League Baseball. How do you explain to someone who is a baseball fan who has not yet visited Cooperstown why they need to visit the Baseball Hall of Fame?
You can, if you've never been there, it's a crash course in baseball history, and you can soak in as much as you want. You can focus in on the last 10 years, or you can look at stuff from the 1870s. It's Mecca for baseball fans. And when you walk down the room with all the plaques, which has actually changed since I went back for the first time in May, and it's a little different than it was when I was a kid. When you walk down those plaques, you could spend hours just reading about players you never heard of, things about players, seeing the bronze, awesome. the beautiful head shots on the plaques, the statues, some of the stuff they have, the jerseys and the lockers, and now it's a little more interactive with videos and games you can play. And as much as I love the Hall of Fame itself, Cooperstown is such a charming, the town, being in the town, walking the street where the stores are and seeing the Doubleday Field, but also going to the hall and some of those memorabilia stores and the artwork stores and the stores where they make bats.
So fun.
You could spend a day there, or you could spend 2 weeks there.
I have a lot of memory.
If you care about baseball or baseball history and you haven't been to Cooperstown, you're really missing something.
You got to go. I remember my dad and I had been to the Hall of Fame. We were at the Ripken and Gwynn Hall of Fame induction, which was an incredible thing to see. My two favorite players. We were right up front. We got a great look at all the Hall of Famers. But then I believe it was that night. I hope I'm not mixing up my trips here, but we watched Pedro Martinez on TV in one of the sports bars in Cooperstown really carve up the Florida Marlins. And I never forgot that really awesome baseball memory for me. All right. Just to wrap things up here, not only did you dedicate this book to everyone who has served this country, you've singled out Lieutenant Commander Leonard Sigelman, Technical Sergeant Arnold Lazarus, Staff Sergeant Buddy Lazarus, and Hannah, who you say was your slugger. Who were all these folks, and why did you want to dedicate this book to them?
Well, the first three humans are my
I was wondering if one of them was a dog. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Are my two grandfathers and my godfather, my great uncle, who all served in World War II, and very varying stories I heard growing up, and gave me an appreciation for military history, World War II history. And I think, that the greatest generation element of that, my one grandfather was on a ship in the Pacific that was under heavy fire by kamikaze pilots. My other grandfather was, he used to say D-Day +2. He was a medic. He arrived at D-Day 2 days after, and, bandaged up and took care of soldiers who had been shot and killed during the beaches of Normandy. So, that era, World War II, is sort of romanticized for a lot of people. For me, it was the stories I heard growing up. And Ted Williams and John Glenn both served in World War II. Williams didn't serve abroad, but John Glenn certainly did, and put his life on the line for 2 years in the Pacific. So, it gave me a better appreciation for anyone who served their country, particularly those from that era, when, Nazi totalitarianism could overtake the whole world. So I wanted to make sure that I gave a shout out to them. Now,
and
Slugger,
did Hannah help you write the book?
Yeah, Hannah was my dog, was my best friend for years. I have a soft spot for dogs. Ted Williams had a dog. It's in the book. That's why it's sort of an Easter egg for later in the book. Ted Williams had a dog that he was not happy someone gave him because he did not want it. And he obviously, like a lot of people, warmed to it pretty quickly. The dog's name was Slugger. It was a Dalmatian. I heard him, you hear gruff Ted Williams, all these stories about him. And some of the things I heard him say about Slugger and pictures I saw of 70-year-old Ted Williams with this Dalmatian, he sort of mellowed. He had a soft spot for this dog. I had a soft spot for my dog, Hannah, and she died when I was writing the book. So, just again, I kind of like to dedicate the book to someone different every time. And I do sort of like, if you read some of my other books, you'll see sort of these Easter eggs again. And this was another one of those Easter eggs.
Have you decided at all what's next? Where is your path going to lead you if you're going to do another book?
I'm definitely going to do another book. I have some ideas, nothing set in stone. I'd like to see how this one comes out, see what kind of response it gets. Then I'll just have to write the screenplay for this. It's because it's going to be a big Hollywood movie starring Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, I think, as Ted Williams.
Perfect. You got it all planned out. Now you just have to let them know.
No, yeah, I'll just have to. Hopefully, they'll let me be an extra in like a scene in the background. No, I have not decided what I'm going to do yet next, but I'm very excited about this coming out, and hopefully it's gotten some good reception. Doing some book events and tours and TV and radio, hopefully. So I hope it strikes a nerve with people. Like I said, the first half of the book is kind of a military history book. If you're a military history buff,
I couldn't believe how you must have had to learn a ton about the military.
Yes, I did, and I had to consult a lot of. I was going to say, I consulted a lot of experts, and they're very, very fortunate to have experts. But the second half of the book is kind of like I don't want to say it's a buddy comedy, but it's a story about friendship. And I have a more heightened antenna for this. I've seen, I look at guy relationships, I'm sure, female relationships too, that, pay your pal. Everybody has a pal, a best friend, or just somebody who's a buddy. They may not be a best friend. And I think Ted Williams and John Glenn, they weren't best friends, but there was a connection from a variety of reasons that I think, especially when Ted Williams was dying, was very strong. And that's something that the second half of the book is kind of about that, about the ups and downs of friendship, losing a friend. Ted Williams dies. John Glenn, talks a lot about his feelings about Ted Williams dying and what it meant to him. So it's kind of a 2-part book that I think appeals to a lot of people, and I'm really excited to see what the response is.
Adam Lazarus, the author of The Wingmen, the unlikely, unusual, and unbreakable friendship between John Glenn and Ted Williams. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Check out the book. Check out his website, adamlazarusbooks.com. He's on Twitter at LazarusA57. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.